Most of my guitars are usually made of figured woods. I like the grain and the color transition between them along with the figure. But this time I decided to try to make one out of carbon fiber, which also includes the neck. More of an experiment to see if I could do it rather than anything else. I've built a lot of parts, particularly for cars, out of carbon fiber in the past, so I'm pretty familiar with molding techniques and what's involved in making parts. Initially, you have to start with a plug. Essentially, this is building a full model, finished the best you can. But in this case, I first started out with a Les Paul design, and then since I wanted to try to veneer it, similar to what Emerald Guitars does, I made a different design which would allow me to veneer the center section and leave carbon fiber exposed on the sides. So I built this body. This involves essentially making a complete guitar and finishing it to a really high finish level. I wanted to make the neck integral with the body, so I had some initial shaping so I could fit it to the body first, and then once I had that in place, I could then finish the shape of the neck while it was attached to the body and mold it into shape. I enjoy making necks and shaping them by hand. I do have a CNC and I can make them with that, but almost all my guitars are one-offs and they vary quite a bit, so it's not really worth the effort with the CNC. I'd have to modify them anyway, and I really enjoy doing it. The files I use are simple straight files and some half-round files. I use a Farrier's rasp for heavy wood removal. I find it works really fine. Here I'm shaping the neck itself. Since I'm going to be painting this guitar and priming it and sanding it, I use body filler to fill any gaps or spaces and actually help me to make the contour I'm reaching for. Once it's all done, I use a Duratec catalyzed primer on that. This sands quite well and is especially made for making molds and plugs. The Duratec is sanded with 500 wet sanded. Here I'm preparing to make the parting line, so I trace around the body of the guitar on a foam board, cut this out. I make a wooden support mold to support it, so this allows the foam to lie exactly where I want it to give me the parting line where I would like. Parting line is important because if it's not in the right place, your mold will never separate and the part will be trapped in the mold. You'll end up destroying the mold. Once the mold's in place, the guitar's in place, I use a clay around the area to fill in the joints. Then I wax the entire thing again, and here I'm spraying a PVA mold release agent. It's water-based. It has a light green cast to it. This has to dry completely before you do the next step, which is to apply the gel coat. The gel coat here, it's a red gel coat. It's very thick. This again is catalyzed with MEKP, mixed together for about a minute. And you have to read the instructions. It varies with the heat of your workspace, the curing time. I put this on quite liberally. Everything has to be coated with this, along with the flanges around the outside, since those will be used later on when you're actually molding the guitar. Especially important if you're planning on doing a resin infusion. If you noticed here, actually, this is the Les Paul model that I had initially made. I lost the footage on the coat and fiberglass to the other guitars, so I went ahead and decided, well, I guess I'll do this one too. This is not my favorite job. This stuff is very smelly, and it takes hours to make a mold. So here I've got the base of the body pretty well covered with gel coat. I'll cover all the flanges, and actually I use 2 coats of gel coat on this. Essentially, I use about a quart for the entire mold. It's really expensive. It's about $40 a quart. Here's the fiberglass resin. I just use Bondo resin. You don't really need anything special here. Some of the laminating resins are thinner, but the Bondo works fine. Here what I do is all the joint areas where there's right angles or close to that, I initially put a layer of resin down, and then I put a chopped mat in these areas. This is to fill any voids. What happens if these are not filled in and you get any bridging of your fiberglass, you're going to have holes in the mold that you're going to have to fill these in before you're going to be able to mold anything, and it just makes an awful lot more work. I found this to work quite well. I can make sure that there's no open spots or trapped air in these areas. Once that's done, it's important before you lay any fiberglass on, you coat the entire mold with fiberglass resin. Then you lay your mat. I just use mat. It's 4 layers of mat to cover the entire area. This is only one side of the mold. This will all be repeated on the other side, but it's the same process, and you just lay a layer down, put the fiberglass on, tap it down, then use a roller to remove any potentially trapped air, and then go on to the next. It's best not to let the layers dry so that you have good adhesion be layer to layer. Here's the final area after the 4th layer. This is the roller I use to roll out any type of air bubbles. These are pretty common and available at any fiberglass supply place. Now I usually let these dry at least overnight, sometimes even a few days, because I want to make sure they're totally rigid, particularly with this one, because the neck angle and position is set, and if that moves at all, the guitar is pretty well ruined. So here's the 3-piece guitar, popping it out of the mold. There it goes. Those brown areas are clay. They'll all be scraped out. They're not necessary to leave in the area. But the plug looks good. It's not damaged at all, and can be used to make more molds if you so wish. Here are the 2 sides with the plug taken out. Here I'm sanding the gel coat with a 600 grit wet sandpaper, then I go over with 5 coats of a parting wax. There's not going to be any PVA in here, and if the epoxy sticks, your mold is ruined. There's a paper pattern to trace the veneer and cut the veneer. Here I'm cutting out the carbon fiber. I try to cut this pretty close. Carbon fiber is very expensive. It's about $40 a yard. And I usually use at least 3 to 4 pieces for each side. So it turns out to be quite a bit of money in each guitar. So here I'm applying the epoxy resin. This is initially for the veneer coat. I apply this quite thickly. It's important to lay down a real thick coat because if there's any voids, your veneer is going to be exposed on the front side, and that's going to require an awful lot of repairs and filling with more epoxy resin and sanding to make up those voids. So you got to take a lot of care here to make sure every crevice has got a good resin coating, and also to make sure your pattern and your veneer fits just right. So here I'm placing the veneer in the area. The tape you see on the back side, that's veneer tape. This was a book matched veneer, so I cut it so that the areas would be book matched and left the seam tape in place. It does not show through, and it's fine. The epoxy adheres quite well to it. This very thin material. So once that's in place, I'm going to coat that along with the surrounding areas with the epoxy resin. As I mentioned before, this is a slow setting resin. This has at least an hour of work time, and it takes me about a little over an hour to laminate all these parts to get the 4 layers of veneer in there and make sure that there's no voids. It's quite a bit of time. This is where resin infusion is nice, because you place all your materials in place, you get everything all set, you get it actually bagged in the bag so that you know everything's perfect, and then you open the valve to the resin, and the resin sucked all the way through the material. But here I'm laying the first piece of carbon over that. You want to be sure you place it and try not to move it, particularly once it's in place, because if you do, you can really stretch the fabric and it'll show in the pattern. So I'm gently initially pushing it down so that it fits, and I'm not stretching the pattern. Once I've got everything into place, I'll be much more aggressive to make sure all the seams fit very tightly in the area. Here I'm just preparing the piece for the neck. This is a very thick piece. It's a straight weave material. I actually use 3 pieces in the neck. The neck is extremely strong once these cured, much stronger than a wooden neck. Again, same thing, just pat it down. Don't really brush. It's more of a patting motion. You'll hear I'm doing exactly what I said not to do, but it's better to pat it than to really brush it, unless you've got a lot of material you're trying to spread out. The patting into place is really the best way to go. So repeat this case. I think I used 2 full layers, and then I used pieces to fill in the rest. This is peel ply. This is material that actually will not bond to the epoxy and allow a separation of all the materials you put over this. You've got to make sure everything's in place. This is a infusion matrix breather. I used that. It probably was not necessary. Actually, it isn't necessary, and it just made more work actually removing it afterwards. But I guess it's just a habit from my resin infusion that I put that down. The breather fabric is really absorbs all the excess resin and allows the vacuum to be pulled. I have a large vacuum bag. I bag the entire piece in the vacuum bag. This is very important because it allows a tremendous amount of pressure to come down into the mold to make sure all the areas are sealed tightly. This bag is nice because you just wrap it around a plastic tube, and then an outer tube fits over it, and it seals perfectly well. Here's the resin, the air being evacuated from the bag. It's slow, but it's always fun to see and really interesting. Every time this happens, it's kind of neat. You really can't see it here through the breather fabric, but it sucks down Well, here's the part finished. It's a wax coating where it looks not so sweet. Here's the bottom parts of the other side. In part two, I'll start putting the guitar together. That'd be pretty interesting. Certainly, if you found any interest in this, please comment, please subscribe. There's a lot more to come in the second part. Thank you for watching.